Hey everyone, we're looking at tissues in this lecture, and in summary, a tissue is any collection of cells that are similar type cells. So you can have skin cells together, and then it makes skin tissue, or muscle cells together, muscle tissue. Anytime there's a grouping of similarly typed cells, creates a tissue. There's like 150 or 200 types of cells in your body, and those end up arranging into something like 20 or 30 different kinds of tissues, and we'll look at a subset of those in this lecture. Regardless of what tissue it is, you can categorize any tissue in your body into one of four categories, and they are the following. There's the epithelial tissues, the connective tissues, the muscle tissues, and the nervous tissues. Now, a little bit about these. The epithelial tissues are considered to be like boundary tissues. They're any place where your body needs some protection. These tissues are characterized by cells that have tight cell-to-cell junctions. And what I mean by this is when the cells are lined, these tissues have cells that have cells that are really tightly stuck together. And the purpose is that they offer protection. And other tissues in your body that are more loose, the cells can actually be detached from one another, and there can be space in between them. But that's not the case here. There's very tight cell junctions. Because of that, there's actually no blood supply to these tissues, because there's simply no room for blood vessels to pass through those tight junctions. And then these are interesting in that they actually have two sides to it. There's what's known as the apical side and the basal side. And so generally how it works is that the apical side would be the side that's facing the outside of your body, or it could be what's known as the lumen of a tube. And then the basal side would be on the other side. So here's an example. You would find epithelial tissues on your skin, and so let's imagine that this was your skin, and this is down deep into your body, and this is like air up here. Okay, there would be epithelial tissue here. It's a boundary between the outside environment and your skin. Well, the side of the cells that faces towards the air would be called the apical side, and the side that faces the underlying tissues would be called the basal side. Now, this same convention is true even for places that are actually inside your body, where there can still be a boundary required. So like an example here would be like, let's say your digestive tract, it's a tube, right? And the inside of a tube, anatomy speaking, is called the lumen, is the anatomical general word there for any inside of a tube. And then think about your digestive tract, you would have food and stuff passing through this tube. Well, that food could be somewhat abrasive, it could be somewhat foreign, and so there needs to be a boundary between anything that's going through your digestive tract and the tissues underneath. And so there's epithelial tissue here. And again, the side that's facing the lumen or the outside would be the apical side, and the side that's facing the underlying tissues would be called the basal side. Epithelial tissues usually rests on a basement membrane, so that's like a sheet that all the cells are attached to. And they can one last thing about them is that they can either be one layer or they can be many layers. If it's one layer, it's called a simple tissue. And if it's many layers, it's called a stratified tissue. And we'll look at specific examples of epithelial tissues here in a minute, but this is generally how you'd categorize them. The connective tissues, this is a really diverse category. And the cells here are different than epithelial cells in that they're not linked together with tight cell junctions. They can actually be spread out a little bit. And one of the unifying features of connective tissue is the fact that there is, in between the cells, what's known as an extracellular matrix. And the extracellular matrix, extra means outside, cellular means cell, and matrix refers to the fact that it's generally fibrous. There's different fibers in here that give some structure to this space. And in addition to the structural component that exists between the cells, there's also like a filler. And that filler, whatever is filling in all of the space, is called the ground substance. So regardless of what type of tissue it is, it's going to have an extracellular matrix and a ground substance. Now, the type of tissue here its qualities can vary quite a bit. So for example, bone is considered a connective tissue, and here the ground substance is a calcium crystal, and it's really hard. And the extracellular matrix is conferred by these fibers called collagen fibers, which is a very common type of fiber that is found in tissues. There could also be cartilage, which is a similar type tissue. It's just the ground substance, rather than being calcium crystals, is something called chondroitin sulfate. And you don't have to know that, but it just makes it a little bit more flexible. You could have a tissue like this being fat tissue, and then there would be some fluid in here, or even blood is a connective tissue, and in between the cells of the blood there's a fluid that exists called blood plasma, and that would be the ground substance. So while it's all very diverse, they'll have these two features to them, and we'll look at a few examples here of specific examples of connective tissues. All right, the muscle, what you could say about this is that muscle has this unique property of being excitable. And what excitable means is that it can respond to basically nervous impulses. Each one of your muscle cells has a little nerve attached to it, a little neuron attached to it, such that when your brain can, for all your skeletal muscle, your brain can send a signal down, and it can interact with the muscle and cause it to contract, so it can respond. Not all tissues that have neurons and nerves attached to them would respond in this way, but muscle is designed in such a fashion that it can respond to these changes in voltage, these little nervous impulses, so we call it excitable. And then nervous tissue will just, this is composed of these cells called neurons, and also a whole bunch of different types of support cells, which are just collectively called the glial cells, and we'll talk, I'll show you specifically a little bit about what those look like. All right, so we'll begin first then with the epithelial tissues, and we said they can either be simple or stratified. Simple means it's just one layer. Stratified means many, and they have different shapes to them. So there's three different shapes: the squamous cells, the cuboidal cells, and the columnar cells. And squamous are the ones specifically that are flat. This word squamous it comes from either the Latin or the Greek word, which means scale-like, and that means it's sort of flat. Well, one place that you find simple squamous epithelium is in the little pockets that air travels to inside of your lungs. The final destination of air, when you breathe it in, it goes down through all these tubes into these little air sacs, which are called alveoli, and you're actually seeing those here. Well, what forms the boundary of the alveoli are these flat cells called squamous epithelial cells. So actually what you're seeing here, anytime when you're looking at a slide of tissue such as this, anytime you see a dark staining nucleus, or anytime you see a darker dot, it usually means a nucleus of a cell. For whatever reason, the stain that's used is a darker stain for the nucleus. So that usually tells you where each individual cell is. And if you look at some of these cells, like here's one cell right here, there's a nucleus and it's spread out very thin. And here's another cell, it's spread out very thin. Here's another cell, it's spread out very thin. And it's not that there's cells piled on top of each other, it's just basically balls formed from this one layer of cells. So it's a simple squamous epithelium. Okay, you could have a stratified squamous epithelium, and that would look something more like this. So this, to somebody that's a little bit more trained to recognize this tissue, this would be about where the basement membrane is. So this is where all the epithelials are stacked on top of one another. I know that because I can see the consistency of this tissue is quite a bit different than the consistency of this tissue. Many more cells packed together here. And you're going to notice that there's many layers, so each one of these dots again represents a cell, and you can see that the cells at the top start to flatten out, and they are a flat shape, so we call them squamous. So there's many layers of cells, so it's stratified, and they're flat, so we call it a squamous, stratified squamous. And the example that we're seeing here, this is your skin, actually. So this would be the surface of the skin here. And then there are many, many, many layers of cells. It can be about 20 or 30 or 40 layers of cells before you get to the underlying tissues underneath your skin. And these cells are always dividing at the bottom, but as they get further away, remember, no blood inside of an epithelial tissue, so as they get further away from the underlying tissue where the blood vessels and things are, where they can get nutrients, they actually start to die, and eventually they just accumulate as these little scales of armor, which are basically just dead cells, honestly. And these cells will slough off, they'll suspend in the air, they can spread out throughout the room and eventually land on things like your bookshelves and your dressers, and it collects as dust. So when you see dust, sometimes it's the case that it is partially made up of your cells. Right, but many layers, flat cells, stratified squamous. This shows a tissue of what's of simple cuboidal epithelium. And what you're actually seeing here, this is a cross-section of your kidney, and in your kidney there are a whole bunch of tubes that are running along, and you can see that these are the cross-section of those. So these are all the tubes that have been sliced transversely, so you can see the cross-section of them. And if you look, here's like the lumen of each tube. Here's the lumen of this tube. Here's the lumen of this tube. If you look at these cells, here's the nucleus, so you know there's only one cell thick between the basement membrane, which would be this outer ring here, and the cell. There's only one cell thick, so it's simple. But if you look at the shape of the cell, for the most part, these cells are somewhat cube shaped. If you get in here and look really carefully at the cell boundaries. And so that's why we call it cuboidal. You see the root word in here, cube, should tell you that these types of cells are not flat, but rather they have a width and a height that's approximately equivalent. All right, lastly, then we have the simple columnar epithelial tissues. Here, the same story. There's some sort of basement membrane, and if you know what you're looking for, it looks something like this, where I'm drawing this line. And then on that are the cells, and they're packed together. You can see inside here is a nucleus of each cell, and these are really tall cells. They're much taller than they are wide, so we call them columnar cells. And you'll probably notice the word column in that word. Should help you remember what the shape of these cells are. You find these types of cells lining different ducts and tracts in your body. One of them is the digestive tract. So in your digestive tract, you actually have, if you were to look really closely at it, you have all these little extensions called villi. And on top, and wrapping around those villi are all the individual columnar cells. Okay, that's all we're going to look at here for the epithelial tissues. The next category then are the connective tissues. So one of probably the easiest ones to spot is adipose tissue. And adipose tissue is essentially just fat. And what you're seeing here is each one of these is a cell, and you can see they have a little nucleus pushed off to the side of most of them. And inside, it appears like it's all white, empty space. But it's not actually empty. It's full of oil or triglycerides. So these cells, they lose a lot of their other cellular contents just to make room for storing as much oil as they possibly can. And that makes the tissue a really good energy storage tissue. This is another type of connective tissue, and this one is also pretty easy to identify because it looks like it's black and white. There aren't many other tissues that are monochromatic like this. And this would be bone. So what you're seeing here is a cross section of the functional unit of bone. This would be right here, a whole functional unit of it. And a functional unit of any organ is like the repeating thing that happens over and over again that makes the organ have its special characteristics. Well, the functional unit here in the bone is called the osteon. And I won't go into too much detail here, but you can think of an osteon being like a straw that runs up and down through the bone. So we're seeing the cross section of that straw, and it's the collection of all those straws that make your bone strong. Okay, blood vessels and nerves and things will run up and down through the middle of the straw, up and down through your bone. You'll see then there are these little concentric rings of you'll see there's these little concentric rings of bony material, and you're also going to see all these little dark splotches. Well, those dark splotches are actually the cells that live in the bone, and some people don't realize that bones are actually a living tissue. It's not just like a big white hunk of matter like you would see on like a skeleton. They're full of cells in here. It's a living thing. And curious though, because this bone is so dense, there actually are these little caves carved out, and the caves are called lacunae. And they are like hollow spaces where then cells can occupy. Generally, a cell can't be totally fixed into a solid tissue. It needs to have a little bit of room. It has to be able to move a little bit. And these caves create the space for them to live. And then in order to get nutrients to those caves, there are all these little cracks in the ground substance in the bony matrix here that allow nutrients to get into and out of the caves where all the bone cells live. So this is a very hard tissue. The ground substance here would be, again, a variety of calcium crystals, and then there are actually collagen fibers running through and strengthening the tissue as well. Okay, this is a picture of blood. And blood, if you plate it out in a really thin layer, you can actually see all of the individual red blood cells. So those are these reddish looking circles that we're seeing. You'll also occasionally see a white blood cell, which is quite a bit larger, and it's going to have a dark staining bodies in them. So that's the tell that those are white blood cells and not red blood cells. You won't see any dark staining bodies in red blood cells. Red blood cells actually don't even have a nucleus, so they're a little bit unique in that way. All of this white space then that you see in between the cells, this is the fluid part of blood. So blood's got a cellular part, and it's also got a fluid part, and that fluid that exists between the cells is called plasma. You're also going to note one other little detail here. You'll see that there's these little packets, and these are just little dark purple staining specks. Those are called platelets, and they help in the coagulation response that blood does. So blood has its own innate ability to coagulate and form blood clots, and this is a really good thing. If you get a cut on your hand, eventually it will stop bleeding. If it didn't, you would just continue to bleed, which would be a bad thing. And the reason why is that when there is damage to a blood vessel, there's a whole biochemical pathway that gets underway that ultimately results in these platelets forming big clumps, and then the platelets clump up and block whatever the injury site is, wherever the blood vessel has been opened up, whether it's been cut or torn or what, and they'll patch up that hole and keep blood from escaping. So a really valuable component there in the blood. All right, what we're seeing here, this is cartilage, and cartilage is similar to bone in that it is more of a dense tissue, and there is going to be little caves in that dense ground substance, which are also called lacunae. Inside the lacunae are where the cartilage cells live, and the cartilage cells are called chondrocytes. Um, chondra is the prefix that's often associated with cartilage. So you got chondrocytes living in lacunae in this tissue. There are different types of cartilage, and we won't have to worry about differentiating those in this class. Okay, this is one of the most common tissues, and what we're seeing here, this is more of a loose connective tissue. What we're seeing are dark staining nuclei here, and in between them are a bunch of different fibers. So these darker fibers are called elastin fibers. Or you could call them elastic fibers. And they're going to make it so the tissue is a little bit squishy or flexible. You'll also see then there are these more stocky pink fibers. And those are collagen fibers. And collagen fibers generally tend to be more stiff and strong. So here we have a tissue that's got some stiffness to it. It can resist stretching and straining, but you can also see that it's flexible. It has elastin fibers in it, and it's also quite loose. There's a bunch of space in between all the fibers. So this is considered to be somewhat of a packing material, this type of tissue here. This tissue is called areolar connective tissue. And areolar connective tissue is found in a lot of places. Basically, any place there's empty space between your organs or wrapping around your organs, there's this web-like tissue that is packed in between and keeps things anchored together, but it also allows things to pass through it. So it's a really great tissue, and you find a lot of it in the human body. All right, then we're going to move on then to muscle tissue. And there are three different kinds of muscle tissue. There's skeletal muscle tissue, there's cardiac muscle tissue, and there's smooth muscle. And there's a couple of different properties to them. Skeletal muscle is the muscle that attaches to your bones and is what we would say voluntary, meaning it is subject to your own volition, meaning you can contract it if you want to. You can contract it and you can relax it. On the flip side, cardiac and smooth muscle are then involuntary, meaning you can't contract them if you want. Your heart's going to beat whether you want it to or not. Your smooth muscle is going to contract whether you want it to move or not. So a little bit difference there in the way that the wiring is arranged in allowing you action over the muscle. There are also some differences in the appearance of these. So skeletal and cardiac muscle, we're going to have these characteristic little stripes, which are called striations, whereas smooth muscle does not. All right, let's take a look at some of these. This is a picture of skeletal muscle, and what you're going to note are these long cylinder-shaped muscle fibers. Each one is one muscle cell, and skeletal muscle is unique because the cells are multinucleated, meaning there are several nuclei running up and down along the cell, and the cell can be actually quite massive. It can be on the order of centimeters or inches long, which for a cell is huge. Most cells are a couple hundred micrometers long, which is microscopic. Okay, you'll see these are the pinstripes, the striations moving up and down, and that's going to be some of the unique features there of skeletal muscle. Okay, this is then cardiac muscle, and it's got a few differences. One is if you're trained to see it, you'll see that this has cells that are branched. So I can kind of carve out the boundaries here of some of these cells to show you that they have little branches to them. So it's not just a singular cylinder. These cells are actually a lot smaller too, and generally they only have one central nucleus in the cell. So that makes them different than skeletal muscle. But they do have the striations because they utilize the same mechanism for contraction. And that's where the striation comes from. The other difference then is that they have these darker boundaries between cells, and this is because the connections between cardiomyocytes, or muscle cells of the heart, are really anchored together. So this, keep in mind, a heart is going to beat and contract and contract and beat every second of every hour of every day of your life. That's a lot of wear and tear, and to keep the cells from pulling apart from one another over the years, they have a really strong connection between adjacent cells. All right, then smooth muscle looks something like this, and this is actually somewhat of a horrible picture, so I apologize for that, but it's trying to find a good place where you can see it. The interesting thing about smooth muscle is that, for one, it's not striated, so you won't see those little stripes moving up and down, and that has to do with the arrangement of the different filaments that are used for it to contract. It doesn't have the same contractile apparatus as the skeletal and cardiac muscle. But also the cells will be what's known as a spindle shape. So each end in this respect is tapered, and then it's larger in the middle. That's a unique shape for muscle cells, and it's characteristic of smooth muscle. And where you find smooth muscle is found in all sorts of places in the body. Smooth muscle is found along your digestive tract, and it's the waves of contraction of this muscle that help propel food down your digestive tract. You find smooth muscle like in the iris of your eyes. It constricts and relaxes to either open or close your iris, and make your pupil larger or less large. Smooth muscle is in a whole bunch of different places. It's scattered around throughout your body, and it's any place that movement is required. And generally, you can't feel when these muscles are contracting, just as you can't really generally feel your heart contracting either. And then the skeletal muscle is found anywhere where the muscle is attached to your skeleton and is moving your skeleton when you contract it. Okay, then the last tissue we have here is the nervous tissue, and this is a slide that shows a sample of that. What you're going to see here are large cell bodies of neurons, which is one type of cell. And then you're going to see also a scattering of these little dark staining nuclei here of the glial cells. And the difference between these neurons are considered to be like the wires that are actually transmitting the signal along a nerve. And the glial cells are like the support cells that make sure the neurons have everything they need to do what they do. And a general way for what a neuron looks like, it's got, I guess there's a variety of different types of neurons, but a classic multipolar neuron, such as one that would be like a neuron that innervates your muscle, looks something like this. There's a receiving end on one end, and on the receiving end there are these little spiky things, which are called dendrites. And then there is a part of this neuron that is very much just like a normal cell. There's the nucleus here, there are different organelles here, and that is called the cell body. And then what makes a neuron quite unique is that there's this really long extension that can be variable in length, like it can be in your brain, the interneurons of your brain, it can only be a couple hundred microns long, or if it's a neuron that's running along a nerve that goes all the way down to like a muscle in your toe, let's say, it could be like a meter long. So it varies greatly, but that long projection is essentially the wire that a signal will travel through, and that's called the axon. And then at the very end of the line are these little extensions, which are called the terminals. So a neuron can receive a signal, and generally what a signal is it's chemicals that bind to the neuron and alter its voltage across the membrane. And it's a long story, we won't really get into it here, but if the voltage is brought to a certain amount of change, it causes a whole bunch of things to happen, which then send a jolt of electricity, for lack of a better word, down the axon. That electricity will go all the way down to the terminals, and then it will release more chemicals to be released, which then, if it's attached to another neuron, would then stimulate that to continue on the chain. So I often think of neurons being like dominoes, where they fall, and as they fall, they knock the next one down, and then they knock the next one down, and then they knock the next one down, and through all of them being knocked down, they carry a signal from one place to another. In either case, that's what we're seeing here. This is the cell body of the neuron, and these neurons, I think this is probably motor neurons from like a ox spinal cord or something. They're a little bit atypical, but you can still see some of the dendrites coming off, and then they will also have a large axon that comes off, which we can't really see super well in this particular image. But okay, then the glial cells, there's a whole bunch of different kinds of glial cells, and we won't go into it again here, but it's just important to note when you see a picture of the tissue that you know what the difference is between these little cells and then the big cells. All right, so here we can try a little bit of review, and I'll go through and show you a picture of all of these, and then if you want you can follow along and see if you can answer what they are. Here's number 1. Here's number 2. Number 3. 4. 5. 6. 7. 8. 9. 10. 11. 12. And lastly, 13. All right, here are the answers if you were following along. Number 1 was simple columnar epithelium. And generally, if you see like a white space like this, it suggests that there's a polarity to the tissue, meaning there's two sides to the tissue. And that is characteristic of epithelial tissues, to have one side be exposed and the other side to be anchored. And then we see that the cells are quite tall, so it's columnar, and there's only one layer of them. I know it's only one layer because I'm only seeing one dark staining nucleus between the membrane onto which they're attached and then the empty space here. So that's simple columnar. This would be smooth muscle. Here we have simple squamous epithelium. Remember the really thin cells here that are only one layer thick. Here this is compact bone. This is cartilage. Here we have stratified squamous. This is areolar connective tissue. Here's cardiac muscle, adipose tissue, nervous tissue, the neurons and the glial cells. This is simple cuboidal. Again, specifically it would be just this tissue here that's forming the tube. It's one layer of cells to form the wall of the tube, and they're roughly cube-shaped, so it's cuboidal, simple cuboidal. This is showing skeletal muscle. Note the striations, and then also note that it's a long cylinder that has several nuclei on it. And then lastly, blood. Okay, well, it gets way more complicated than this, but for at least our purposes, this is a nice little taste of the different types of tissues that could be found in the human body. And if you wanted to learn more, you could go on to take a human anatomy class, and you'd learn there's a whole bunch of other different kinds, and they all have many more features to them to talk about. But at least in our class, this is going to be sufficient for a nice little survey here of the tissues.